Ruby Sinclair was 7 years old and she knew three things about her father that the other kids at school did not. First, his hands were always warm even in winter. Second, he could fix anything that was broken from a bicycle chain to the sound of her voice when she got scared at night. Third, when he walked into a room, every other person in that room got quieter. Not because they were being polite, because they were afraid. She didn't understand the third thing, not really, not yet. She just knew that when her dad picked her up from school on his Harley, the crossing guard's smile got a little tighter, and the other mothers pulled their children a half step closer. She thought it was the motorcycle. She thought they were just nervous about the noise. She was 7. She was allowed to be wrong about a few things. Her mother had left when Ruby was 3. She had no memories of the woman, only a photograph that Forge kept in the drawer of his nightstand face down, as if even looking at it cost something he couldn't afford. Ruby had learned not to ask about her. The one time she had her father's face had done something she had never seen it do before. It had crumbled. Just for a second, just at the edges, but she had seen it, and she had decided that some questions were too expensive to ask twice. So it was just the two of them, Forge and Ruby, a biker and his daughter. He braided her hair before school with fingers that could crush a man's hand. He read to her at night from books with pictures of rabbits and friendly bears, his deep voice turning the words soft and round. He kept her world small and safe and warm, and in return she kept his world anchored to something that wasn't leather and chrome and the business of being feared. That afternoon in late October, Ruby walked home alone. Her father had called earlier and told her Brick would be outside the school gates waiting, but when the final bell rang and she pushed through the double doors into the pale autumn light, the sidewalk was empty. No leather cut, no chrome glinting in the sun, just other parents in minivans and the slow churn of yellow buses pulling away. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. The crossing guard asked if she needed to call someone. Ruby shook her head. She knew the way home. She had walked it once before when Brick got caught in traffic, and her father had met her halfway, scooping her off the ground with one arm. His face set in an expression she would later learn was controlled fury at the idea that she had been alone for even 12 minutes. Today she would take the shortcut, through the lot behind the old laundromat, across the cracked parking strip, and down the narrow alley that ran behind the abandoned convenience store on Fletcher Street. It shaved 7 minutes off the walk. 7 minutes that would change the trajectory of more lives than she could count. The alley smelled like wet cardboard and rust. Puddles from the morning rain sat in the broken concrete, reflecting a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. Ruby adjusted her backpack, the pink one with the iron-on patches her father pretended to hate, but had carefully pressed on himself one Sunday morning when he thought she was still asleep. One of the patches was a skull with wings. She didn't know what it meant. She just thought it looked warm. She was halfway through the alley when the voice came from behind her. "Hey, you're Forge's kid, right?" Ruby stopped. She turned slowly. 2 boys stood at the alley's entrance, blocking the way she had come. They were older, much older. Teenagers. One was tall and angular with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unfinished. The other was shorter, broader, with a nervous energy that moved through his body like electricity looking for a ground wire. The tall one wore a baseball cap pulled low. The shorter one had his hands stuffed deep into a hoodie that was too big for him. Ruby's stomach tightened. She didn't know their names yet. In time, she would learn them. Trent, Decker, names that would be whispered in rooms she hadn't yet entered, names that would be written into a story she hadn't yet begun to tell. But in that moment, they were just 2 shapes against the light, and the light was getting smaller. "My dad's coming to get me," Ruby said. Her voice didn't shake. She had her father's blood in her, and that blood didn't shake for strangers. Trent smiled. It was the kind of smile that adults use when they've decided something ugly and want to enjoy the moment before it arrives. "No, he isn't," Trent said. "We made sure of that." Ruby didn't understand what that meant. She would learn later that Brick had been sent on a false errand, a phone call from a number that didn't exist claiming a delivery at the wrong address across town. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched the routine and found the gap. "What do you want?" Ruby asked. Trent walked forward. His sneakers scraped on the wet concrete. Behind him, Decker followed, head swiveling to check that the alley was still empty. It was. "Your dad got my brother thrown out of this city," Trent said. His voice was thin and hard like a wire pulled too tight. 2 years ago. Told him if he ever came back, he'd be carried out. My brother hasn't been home since. Ruby shook her head. I don't know about that. No, Trent agreed. You don't, but you're going to. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. Ruby tried to turn, tried to run toward the other end of the alley, but Decker was faster. He cut around the side and blocked her path, arms wide, grinning with something that looked like fear, disguised as excitement. Trent grabbed her backpack strap and yanked. Ruby stumbled backward, her shoes slipping on the wet ground. She hit the wall hard, shoulder first, and the impact knocked the air from her lungs. Her backpack ripped open along the seam, spilling crayons and a small cloth doll onto the grimy concrete. Please, Ruby gasped. Please don't. Trent crouched in front of her close enough that she could see the faint scar running along his jawline. Every time your dad walks around this city like he owns it, I think about my brother sleeping in his car in some parking lot 2 states away, he said. So yeah, I'm going to make sure Forge knows what it feels like when someone messes with his family. He grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. Pain flared up her arm. Ruby cried out a sound that bounced off the alley walls and disappeared into the gray sky above. Decker dug through her scattered things, laughing at the bull tossing crayons into a puddle one by one. Forge's little princess, Decker said. Not so tough without Daddy's bikes, huh? Ruby's vision blurred with tears. She had never felt this kind of fear before. Not the nighttime kind, not the monster under the bed kind. This was real and physical, and it tasted like iron in her mouth where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. Her wrist burned where Trent held it. The wall was rough and cold against her back. And the laughter that was the worst part. The sound of 2 people enjoying her pain as if it were entertainment. She would carry that laughter in her chest for years, not as a wound, but as a compass. It would point her toward every moment in her life when she had to choose between silence and standing up. And then from somewhere behind the dumpsters, at the far end of the alley, a voice spoke, thin and rough and barely above a whisper. Let her go. Everyone turned. A boy stood at the edge of the alley's shadow. He was small, maybe 12 years old, though his frame was so thin he could have passed for 10. His clothes were layered and mismatched, a flannel shirt over a stained t-shirt over something else, the uniform of someone who dressed from donation bins and dumpster edges. His shoes didn't match. His hair was matted and unwashed, and there was a smudge of something dark across one cheekbone that might have been dirt or might have been an old bruise. His hands were shaking. His eyes were not. Ethan Marsh had no home, no family, and no reason to be standing in that alley at that moment, except for the simple, irreducible fact that he had heard a child cry, and his feet had carried him toward the sound before his brain could calculate the cost. He had been sleeping behind the dumpster. The concrete there held a little warmth from the laundromat's exhaust vent, and if he curled tight enough, the wind couldn't find him. This had been his spot for 3 weeks now. Before that, he had slept behind the loading dock of a grocery store until the night manager started locking the gate. Before that, a bench in Collier Park until the police ran a sweep. Before that, a burned-out apartment on 7th Street that smelled like smoke and cat urine, but at least had walls. 8 months of this. 8 months since his mother's voice had gone quiet and the apartment they shared had been emptied by people with clipboards and forms and expressions of professional sympathy. 8 months since the system had tried to catch him, and he had slipped through not because he was clever, but because the net had too many holes and nobody was paid enough to stitch them shut. Marie Marsh had worked double shifts at a laundromat not so different from the one at the end of this alley. She was thin and tired and beautiful in the way that exhausted people sometimes are, a beauty that had less to do with features and more to do with the fact that she smiled even when the world gave her no reason to. On her last clear night, she had held Ethan's hand and made him promise something. Not to be strong, not to be successful, to be the kind of person who helps. Ethan carried that promise the way some people carry photographs or lucky coins. It lived in the bottom of his chest beneath the hunger and the cold and the particular loneliness of being 12 years old in a city of millions that had decided you didn't exist. He didn't think about it every day, but it surfaced at certain moments, rising up from wherever promises go when they were waiting to be kept. This was one of those moments. He had been drifting in and out of a thin, restless sleep when the voices woke him. At first, he thought it was just people passing through. Then he heard the fear. It was a specific sound, the cry of someone small who has realized that no one is coming. Ethan knew that sound. He had made it himself 8 months ago in a different alley in a different part of the city when three older boys had kicked his bag into a puddle and pushed him into a wall and taken the only photograph he had left of his mother. Nobody had moved that day. People had watched from windows and doorways, and not a single one had stepped forward. Ethan had decided something in that moment lying on the ground with a split lip and empty hands. He had decided that if he ever heard that sound again, if he ever saw a child cornered by something bigger and meaner, he would move. He would be the one who moved. "What did you just say?" Trent straightened, releasing Ruby's wrist. The girl slumped against the wall, cradling her arm. "I said let her go." Ethan's voice cracked on the last word, but the words themselves held firm. Decker snorted. "You see, this Trent street trash wants to play hero." Trent studied the boy for a moment, the way someone might study an insect that had landed on their food. Annoying, irrelevant, easily crushed. "Walk away," Trent said. "This has nothing to do with you." Ethan stepped fully into the alley. Each step brought him closer to the two boys who outweighed him by decades of meals he had never eaten. He stopped between them and Ruby, planting his feet on the broken concrete, spreading his arms as wide as his thin frame would allow. Behind him, he heard Ruby's ragged breathing. He didn't look back at her. He couldn't afford to. If he saw her face, if he saw how scared she was, the fear might jump from her eyes into his chest and freeze him where he stood. "I don't care what this is about," Ethan said. "She's a kid. You're not going to touch her again." Trent's expression shifted. The annoyance hardened into something darker, something that enjoyed being tested. "You know whose kid she is?" Trent asked, jerking his chin toward Ruby. Ethan didn't. All he saw was a girl with freckles and a torn backpack and tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. "I know she's scared," Ethan said, "and I'm not moving." The first punch came fast. Trent's fist connected with the side of Ethan's jaw, and the boy's head snapped sideways, cracking against the brick wall. Stars exploded behind his eyes. His knees buckled, but he caught himself on the wall, fingernails scraping against rough stone. He pushed himself upright. He spread his arms again. Behind him, Ruby pressed herself into the wall, her small hand reaching out to grip the back of Ethan's shirt. Her fingers dug into the fabric, trembling. "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop." Decker kicked Ethan's legs out from under him. The boy went down hard, palms slamming into the concrete glass, biting into his skin. He hissed through clenched teeth and dragged himself forward, wedging his body back into the space between the bullies and the girl. "Move, rat," Trent snarled. "No!" The word was small and quiet, but it filled the alley like something much larger. Trent grabbed Ethan by the collar and hauled him up, slamming him against the wall. The impact drove the air from Ethan's lungs. Up close, Trent smelled like cheap body spray and something metallic like the inside of a locker. "You think you're a savior," Trent whispered. Ethan couldn't answer. The ringing in his ears was too loud. Trent drew his arm back and punched him in the ribs. Once, twice, 3 times. Each blow landed with a sickening thud that Ruby felt in her own chest. She screamed, she begged. She pulled at Decker's arm, trying to make him stop, but Decker shrugged her off with a casual backhand that sent her stumbling. Ethan heard her stumble. Something inside him, something deeper than pain or fear, something that lived in the place where his mother's voice still echoed, caught fire. Trent dropped him. Ethan crumpled to the ground, ribs screaming, vision narrowing to a tunnel of gray light. The concrete was cold against his face. Blood pooled in the corner of his mouth, seeping into the cracks. For one heartbeat, he considered staying down. Just one moment. Let them pass. Let them leave. Let this not be his problem. Then he heard Ruby crying. Not the loud, dramatic crying of a child who has been denied a toy. The soft, hopeless crying of a child who believes that the world has decided she is not worth the protecting. Ethan planted his palm on the ground and pushed. His body screamed at him to stop, but he kept pushing. Knees first, then one foot, then the other. He swayed, nearly fell, caught himself. Blood dripped from his chin and hit the concrete in small, steady drops. He spread his arms again. "You want her," he rasped. "You go through me." Trent stared at him. For the first time, something other than cruelty flickered across his face. Not respect, not quite, but a kind of disbelief that bordered on confusion. "What is wrong with you?" Decker muttered. Ethan said nothing. He just stood there, a 12-year-old skeleton of a boy, arms out, legs shaking, blood on his face, positioned between violence and a child he had never met. Trent stepped forward, his fist connected with Ethan's shoulder, spinning him sideways. A boot caught his hip. Another hit his back. Ethan went down again, curling around his ribs, and again he dragged himself back to that same spot. The beating continued. Trent was methodical in the way that only someone who enjoyed causing pain could be. He alternated between fists and kicks, never hitting hard enough to end it quickly, just enough to keep the boy on the edge of collapse. Decker stood behind him, occasionally adding a kick of his own, but his heart was clearly less in it. His eyes kept flicking toward the alley entrance. He was nervous. Trent was not. Ethan lost count of the blows. His world narrowed to a single burning point of focus, the space between the wall and the girl. As long as his body occupied that space, she was safe. That was the math. That was the only equation that mattered. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, blurring his vision. He wiped at it with a scraped hand, smearing red across his forehead. His fingers left a trail on the concrete as he pulled himself forward again, inch by inch, repositioning himself with the stubborn, mechanical determination of something that wasn't running on willpower anymore, but on something deeper, something coded into the marrow. He was barely conscious now, operating on something that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with a promise he had made to himself on a different floor, in a different alley, on a night when no one came. Ruby watched. She had stopped crying. Something had changed in her face, something that wouldn't be fully visible for years, but that started right here, right now, in this alley. She was watching a boy with nothing give everything, and the image was searing itself into a part of her mind that would never let it go. She felt something shift inside her chest. It was like a door opening, or a lock turning, or a light coming on in a room she didn't know she had. Later, when she was older, she would understand it as the moment her understanding of courage changed. Before this alley courage was her father's broad shoulders and loud engine. After this alley courage was a skinny boy on his knees, bleeding from everywhere, arms spread wide, saying no. She wiped her eyes. She looked around. The crayons were scattered. Her doll lay in a puddle. But near the wall, half hidden under her torn backpack, Trent's baseball cap had fallen off during the struggle. She reached for it, small fingers closing around the brim. She tucked it under her arm. Evidence. She didn't know the word yet, but she understood the concept. This belonged to him. It would prove he was here. Then she looked toward the mouth of the alley. 30 feet away, the side entrance of a corner store was visible. She had seen a camera mounted above the door. Ruby's mind worked fast, faster than a 7-year-old's mind should have needed to work. She memorized Trent's face, the scar on his jaw. She memorized Decker's hoodie, the logo on the front, the way he shifted his weight when he was nervous. She tucked it all away like crayons into a box, organized and sharp. Then she heard something, distant but growing, a deep rolling thunder that was not weather. Trent heard it too. He froze mid-swing, fist still cocked, head tilting toward the sound. Engines. Not one or two, many. The kind of sound that turned heads and emptied sidewalks. "Dude," Decker said, voice suddenly strained. "You hear that?" The color drained from Trent's face in real time, like watching a glass of milk empty from the bottom. "We need to go," Decker said. "Now." Trent looked down at Ethan, who lay on the concrete in a broken heap, still positioned between them and Ruby. Then he looked at Ruby, who stared back at him with an expression that was no longer terrified. It was something else. Something that said, "I see you, and I will remember." "This isn't over," Trent spat. He kicked Ethan once more hard in the side. Then they ran sneakers, pounding on the wet concrete, disappearing around the corner and into the maze of streets beyond. The alley went quiet. Ethan lay on his side cheek, pressed to the ground, breathing in short, ragged gasps that tasted like blood and concrete dust. The world was spinning at the edges, the sky above tilting like a ship's deck in heavy weather. He couldn't move. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Small hands touched his shoulder. Gentle trembling, warm. "Hey," Ruby whispered. "Hey, stay awake. Please, you have to stay awake." He forced his eyes open. She was kneeling beside him, her face close to his. Freckles across her nose. A tiny rip in the collar of her shirt. Her eyes were glassy with tears, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was doing something harder than crying. She was holding it together. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You don't even know me." Ethan's chest burned, but he shifted just enough to see her face clearly. Yeah, he breathed. I did. Ruby bit her lip. She looked toward the mouth of the alley where the sound of engines was getting louder, closer, filling the air with a vibration she could feel in her teeth. That's my dad, she said. Her voice broke between fear and certainty. He's coming. I need to go to him, but I'm coming back. She squeezed his shoulder with her small hand. Don't leave, she said. Please don't leave. Then she hesitated. She looked at Ethan's battered face, at the blood drying on his lip, at the way his arms were still half extended, as if his body hadn't gotten the message that the fight was over. She pulled off her jacket, a light purple windbreaker that smelled like crayons and laundry detergent, and draped it over his chest. She lifted his head gently, so gently, and slid her torn backpack underneath it, so his cheek wasn't pressed against the cold concrete. Then she scooped up her doll and Trent's cap and ran. Ethan lay alone in the alley. The concrete was hard and unforgiving beneath him, but there was a warmth on his chest now, and something soft under his head, and for a flickering moment, he thought he might not be entirely alone in the world. He tried to hold on to consciousness, but it was like gripping water. His mother's face drifted through the dark behind his eyelids, the way she looked on good days before the sickness hollowed her out. Marie Marsh, who had worked double shifts at a laundromat not so different from the one at the end of this alley, who had made Ethan promise on the last night she could still speak clearly that he would be the kind of person who helped. She hadn't said strong, she hadn't said successful. She had said the kind of person who helps. He wondered through the fog of pain if this counted. The engines grew louder. Shadows stretched across the far wall, growing larger with every second. The vibrations traveled through the concrete and into his bones, a deep rumbling that felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat. Then the world went dark. Ruby ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her small legs pumping her lungs, burning Trent's cap clutched in one hand and her broken doll in the other. She burst out of the alley and onto the sidewalk just as the first wave of motorcycles turned the corner onto Fletcher Street. The sight would have stopped most 7-year-olds cold. 12 Harleys in formation chrome gleaming under the streetlights that were just beginning to flicker on in the early dusk. The sound was enormous, a wall of thunder that pushed the air around it. Leather cuts, heavy boots, tattooed arms faces that made the evening itself look soft. Ruby ran straight toward them. The lead bike slowed. The rider was tall, broad-shouldered, with arms inked from wrist to collarbone, and a leather cut that bore more patches than most of his men combined. His face was hard-carved by years and weather and decisions that would keep lesser men awake for the rest of their lives. But when he saw the small figure sprinting toward him, something behind his eyes cracked open. Dad. Forge killed the engine and was off the bike before it had fully stopped catching Ruby as she launched herself at his chest. He scooped her up with one arm, the other hand already running across her head, her shoulders checking for damage, the way a mechanic checks an engine fast and thorough, and terrified beneath the competence. You're okay, he said. It wasn't a question, it was an instruction. You're okay. The boy, Ruby gasped, pulling back just enough to look at his face. Dad, there's a boy in the alley. They hurt him. They hurt him so bad he wouldn't move. He stood in front of me and he wouldn't move. Forge's face went still, the kind of still that preceded storms. Who hurt you, he asked. Ruby held up Trent's cap. This is his, she said. His name is Trent. The other one is Decker. I remember their faces. And there's a camera on the store, Dad. I saw it. It might have recorded everything. Forge stared at his daughter. She was 7 years old, scraped and shaking, and she had just handed him evidence names and an investigative lead. For a moment, something flickered across his face that had nothing to do with anger. It was awe. He set her down gently. He took the cap from her hand and passed it to Harlan, who had pulled up beside him. Harlan was lean and wiry, with a beard dusted from the road and eyes that missed nothing. He served as the chapter's intelligence, the man who always knew where to look and who to ask. Names are Trent and Decker, Forge said. Camera on the corner store. Get the footage, now. Harlan nodded once and peeled off, engine screaming. Forge looked down at Ruby. Where's the boy, he asked. In the alley, behind the old store. He's hurt bad, Dad, real bad. I put my jacket on him so he wouldn't be cold. Something tightened in Forge's jaw. He lifted his hand 2 fingers, and the convoy shifted behind him like a living thing. Brick dismounted, boots thudding on the pavement. Brick was the largest man in the chapter, built like a refrigerator someone had taught to ride a motorcycle, with a long beard and hands the size of dinner plates. Despite his size, he moved with a gentleness that consistently surprised people who didn't know him. 2 more followed. "Show me," Forge said to Ruby. She took his hand and led him into the alley. The light was different now, dimmer, the last of the afternoon giving way to a bruised purple evening. The alley stretched ahead of them, narrow and cluttered with trash bins and old crates. At the far end, near the wall where Ruby had been pinned, a small shape lay on the ground. Forge's stride slowed as they got closer. Brick was right behind him, and the big man's breath caught audibly when they saw the boy. Ethan was unconscious. A child's purple jacket was draped across his chest. A torn, pink backpack was wedged under his head. Blood had dried in a thin line from the corner of his mouth. His hands were scraped raw, tiny cuts from broken glass glinting in the fading light. His ribs moved with shallow, labored breaths that barely seemed to fill his lungs. He was small, painfully, impossibly small. The kind of small that comes not from age but from months of missed meals and nights spent curled against cold that never quite stopped reaching for you. His collarbones pressed against his skin like handles. His wrists were thin enough that Forge could have circled them with his thumb and forefinger. Even the dirt on his face couldn't hide the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the geography of hunger written plainly on a face that should have been round and soft with childhood. Forge had seen grown men beaten worse. He had seen the aftermath of fights that turned entire rooms into crime scenes. But there was something about a child's body bearing the marks of violence that hit different. It wasn't worse exactly. It was wrong in a more fundamental way, as if the universe itself had made an error and left the evidence on this boy's skin. The other bikers fanned out behind him, forming a loose semicircle. None of them spoke. They had all seen damage before, but the room's silence was not about the damage. It was about the fact that the damage had been sustained on purpose, voluntarily, by a child protecting another child. That distinction sat in the air between them like a dare. Forge crouched beside him. He didn't touch the boy, not yet. He looked at the blood on the concrete, at the scattered crayons, at the small handprint where Ruby had knelt beside him. He looked at the wall where his daughter had been shoved, where a faint smear of something dark might have been her hair catching on the rough brick. His jaw tightened. The muscle near his ear jumped once, twice. "This the kid?" he asked Ruby, though the answer was obvious. Ruby nodded. She was kneeling again, her hand hovering near Ethan's shoulder, afraid to touch anything that might hurt. "He just ran in," she said. "He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask anything. He just stood there and let them hit him." Forge looked at the boy's face. Split lip, swelling jaw, the beginning of a black eye that would take days to fully bloom. 12 years old, if that. Clothes that had been worn too long by someone who had no other options. Shoes that didn't match. A boy with nothing who had given everything. Forge exhaled slowly through his nose. "Brick," he said. The big man stepped forward. He moved with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size, crouching down, sliding one massive arm under Ethan's shoulders and the other beneath his knees. "Easy, kid," Brick murmured. "I got you." Ethan stirred. His eyes flickered open just for a second. He saw a face above him, bearded, tattooed, impossibly large. His body tensed, a reflex, born of months on streets where large men were rarely kind. "Lily TM," he mumbled, his foggy brain reaching for a name that nobody had told him. "Ruby," the girl corrected softly, staying close as Brick lifted him. "My name is Ruby." Ethan's eyes found her face. Even through the haze of pain, something settled in his expression. She was okay. She was standing. That was enough. His eyes closed again. Brick carried him out of the alley. The convoy waited at the curb, engines idling, a wall of chrome and leather between the boy and the world that had failed him. People on the sidewalk stared, some recording on their phones, others looking away with the practiced disinterest of people who had learned not to see certain things. Forge swung onto his bike. Ruby was lifted onto the seat behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her cheek pressed against the leather of his cut. She could feel his heart through the back of his jacket. It was beating faster than normal. Brick settled onto his own bike, cradling Ethan against his chest with one arm, the other on the handlebars. The boy weighed almost nothing. "Stay close," Forge called to his crew. And keep your eyes open. Trent and Decker show up anywhere near my kid, they don't walk away. Low sounds of agreement rippled through the men, some sharp, some satisfied. The engines roared to life. The convoy pulled out a line of headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. People on the sidewalk stepped back. Cars yielded without being asked. Ruby pressed her face against her father's back and watched the alley shrink behind them. The cracked walls, the scattered crayons, the faint dark stain on the concrete where a boy she didn't know had bled for her. She held the image in her mind the way she held a crayon when she was drawing something important. Tight, careful, permanent. The ride to the clubhouse took 11 minutes. Ethan was unconscious for most of it, drifting in a dark space where the vibration of the engine mixed with the phantom sensation of fists and the echo of a small voice saying, "Please don't leave." Once he surfaced, briefly feeling the wind on his face and the impossible warmth of being held by someone who wasn't letting go. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who held him. But for one flickering second, the world didn't feel like a place that was trying to kill him, and that was enough to let him slip back under. Ruby, pressed against her father's back on the lead bike, did not close her eyes. She watched the city scroll past in streaks of neon and shadow the pizza shops and pawn stores and empty lots she had walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. Everything looked different now, sharper, more fragile, as if the whole city was made of the same thin glass that had cut Ethan's hands. She kept turning to look back at Brick's bike where Ethan's small body was cradled against the big man's chest. Each time she looked, she held her breath until she saw movement, the flutter of his shirt in the wind, the slight shift of his head, anything that proved he was still there, still breathing, still in the world. Forge felt her turning. He didn't tell her to stop. He understood. When someone bleeds for you, you don't look away. You watch, you bear witness. That's the minimum the universe asks. The convoy moved through the city like a river, finding its channel instinctive and certain. Other traffic melted to the sides. Pedestrians paused on corners and watched them pass with expressions that ranged from admiration to fear to careful blankness. Forge barely noticed. His mind was running calculations. He didn't enjoy the kind that involved names and consequences, in the particular physics of how fear travels through a neighborhood. Trent. The name sat in his chest like a splinter. He had dealt with Trent's older brother 2 years ago, a small-time dealer who had been foolish enough to set up shop on a block that Forge's chapter had claimed long before the boy was born. The brother had been given a choice: leave the city or stop leaving it under his own power. He chose to leave. Forge had considered the matter closed. Apparently it wasn't. He tightened his grip on the handlebars. The Harley responded, engine deepening to a growl that matched the one building in his chest. The clubhouse sat behind a row of shuttered shops on the both side of the city. From the outside, it was unremarkable, a squat brick building with covered windows and a metal door that had been dented by years and fists and weather. The only clue to what lived inside was the row of motorcycles parked out front, chrome, catching the last of the light like a line of patient soldiers. Inside, the space opened up. A long bar ran along one wall, bottles glinting on shelves behind it. The main room was anchored by a heavy wooden table scarred with years of use, knife marks and beer rings, and the ghosts of hands that had slammed down in anger or celebration. Walls were covered with photos, flags, patches framed behind glass, a visual history of a brotherhood that measured its age not in years but in debts paid and lines defended. Forge pushed through the door first. The room shifted immediately. Conversations dipped. Music lowered. Every head turned toward the entrance and then toward the bundle in Brick's arms. "Table," Forge said. "Clear it." Men moved without question. Bottles were swept aside, cards gathered and pocketed. A clean jacket, worn soft by years, was laid out on the scarred wood surface. Brick lowered Ethan onto it with the care of someone handling a thing made of glass. Ethan winced even in unconsciousness. A small sound escaped his cracked lips, a whimper that he would have been ashamed of if he'd been awake. Ruby climbed onto a bar stool beside the table. She didn't ask permission. She just placed herself there, close enough to see Ethan's face, close enough to be the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes. She still held her broken doll in one hand. In the other, she held nothing but her fingers curled and uncurled, as if reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp. Sawbones appeared. He wasn't a doctor, but he had spent more years patching bullet wounds and broken bones than most emergency room residents. He was older than most of the men in the room, with gray threading through his close-cropped hair and hands that were steady in the way that only comes from decades of practice. He cut away the outer layer of Ethan's shirt with small, precise scissors. The bruises were already darkening across the boy's ribs and torso, deep purples and reds that mapped every place a fist or boot had landed. "Ribs aren't broken," Sawbones said after a careful examination, pressing his fingers along the boy's side with clinical precision. "Bruised deep, though. Hand might have a small fracture. Jaws swollen but intact. He's lucky. Or stubborn. Probably both." "He'll live?" Forge asked. Sawbones glanced up. "He'll hurt for a while, but yeah, he'll live." Ruby exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Forge pulled up a chair and sat near the end of the table close to Ethan's head. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and watched the boy's face. The swelling was worse now, the split lip crusted with dried blood, the beginnings of a bruise spreading across his cheekbone like ink in water. 12 years old. Forge turned the number over in his mind. 12. A boy barely old enough to stay out past dark, and he had stood in front of two teenagers twice his size because a girl he'd never met was crying. The memory surfaced before Forge could stop it. He was 12 himself in an alley not so different from this one, fists up, nose bleeding, standing between a scrawny kid named Danny and three older boys who thought that size was the same thing as strength. No leather cut, no patch, no crew. Just a rage at seeing someone weaker get crushed and a body that moved before his brain could talk it out of moving. An old biker named Wallace had found him afterwards sitting on a curb with a split lip and swollen knuckles. Wallace had looked at him the way Forge was looking at Ethan now, not with pity, with recognition. "Kid's got more heart than half the streets out there," Brick said quietly from behind him. Forge said nothing. He was still looking at Ethan's face, at the way the boy's brow furrowed, even in sleep, as if his body was still bracing for impact. Harlan pushed through the door, tending it under his arm. "Got the footage," he said. "Store owner was happy to hand it over once I explained the situation. Camera caught everything, clear shots of both faces." "And the video?" Forge asked. "Already on local feeds. Someone posted a clip from a phone across the street. It's spreading. Hashtag and everything." Forge's jaw tightened. The video meant the city knew. It meant Trent and Decker's faces were out there. It meant the clock was ticking on whatever those two boys decided to do next, and scared boys with their faces on the internet made decisions that ranged from stupid to catastrophic. "Find them," Forge said, "before they find a hole deep enough to hide in." Harlan nodded and stepped back out into the night. Forge sat in silence for a while. The clubhouse hummed around him, low conversations, the clink of bottles, the creak of leather. But at the table in the small space between the scarred wood and the buzzing strip light overhead, there was only the sound of a boy breathing and a girl keeping watch. Ruby had not moved from her stool. She sat with her legs folded beneath her chin, resting on her arms on the edge of the table, eyes fixed on Ethan's face. She watched each breath as if counting them, as if the numbers themselves were a kind of prayer. "Dad," she said quietly. "Yeah. Is he going to be okay?" Forge looked at his daughter. She was 7 years old and she had just experienced the worst afternoon of her life. And instead of crying for herself, she was sitting vigil over a stranger. "He's tougher than he looks," Forge said. "He didn't go down for those boys. He's not going to go down now." Ruby nodded. She reached out and placed her hand on the table next to Ethan's bandaged fingers, not touching, just close. Just there. "He's the reason I'm here," she said. Not to Forge, not to anyone in particular. Just out loud, as if she needed to hear the words in the air to know they were real. Forge closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his face was set in something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the world had handed his daughter a lesson he could never have taught her himself, and it had almost killed someone in the process. He stood up slowly and walked to the far end of the room, where Brick and two other men waited. "When the kid wakes up," Forge said, his voice low enough that only they could hear, "I want to know everything, where he came from, who lost him, and why nobody bothered to find him." Brick nodded. "And Forge," Brick said. "Yeah, what do we do with him after?" Forge looked back at the table where his daughter sat beside a homeless boy like she was standing guard. A girl who had been a victim 2 hours ago and was now something else entirely. Something that looked from a distance remarkably like a protector. "We figure that out," Forge said when he opens his eyes. He walked back to the table and sat down again. Ruby hadn't moved. She had her chin on her arms, her eyes on Ethan's face, and she was humming something so soft it was barely audible. Forge recognized it after a moment. It was the lullaby he used to sing to her when she was small, the one his own mother had sung before she disappeared into whatever darkness had claimed her. He hadn't sung it in 2 years. He didn't know Ruby remembered it. But here she was humming it to a boy she had known for less than an hour, as if the melody itself could hold him in the world. Forge leaned back in his chair and let his head rest against the wall. He thought about Wallace, the old biker who had found him bleeding on that curb 30 years ago. Wallace hadn't asked questions that first night. He had just taken Forge home, cleaned him up, put a plate of food in front of him and said, "You can stay if you want. If you don't want, you can go. But the food's here either way." Forge had stayed. He had stayed for 12 years until Wallace died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning with his boots by the bed and his cut hung on the chair. By then, Forge was already patched, already riding, already becoming the man the city would learn to be cautious around. But underneath the leather and the ink and the reputation, he was still the 12-year-old boy on the curb, the one who needed someone to say the food's here either way. He looked at Ethan. The boy's breathing had steadied slightly, the shallow gasps giving way to something deeper, more regular. Sawbones had done his work well. The bandages around the ribs were tight and clean, the cuts on his face covered with small strips of medical tape. In sleep, with the blood cleaned away, Ethan looked even younger. The sharp angles of hunger and exposure softened into something that was simply a child. A child who should have been in a bed in a house with someone who knew his name. Instead, he was on a table in a biker clubhouse, wrapped in a stranger's jacket, breathing borrowed air. Ruby yawned. She tried to fight it, pressing her lips together, but the yawn won. Her eyes were heavy, the adrenaline of the afternoon finally burning down to embers. "You should sleep," Forge said. "Not until he wakes up," Ruby said. Forge studied his daughter, 7 years old. Scraped knees, tangled hair, a shirt with a torn collar. She had been attacked, terrorized, thrown against a wall by boys who wanted to use her as a message to her father. She should have been the one being carried to safety. She should have been the one crying in someone's arms. Instead, she was sitting vigil. "You know," Forge said carefully, "what happened today wasn't your fault." "I know," Ruby said, but her fingers twisted in the hem of her shirt, and Forge recognized the gesture. It was the one she made when she was carrying something she thought was too heavy to put down. "You cut through the wrong alley," Forge said. "That's a mistake. We all make mistakes, but what they did, that's on them. And what he did," he nodded toward Ethan. "That was his choice, a good one." Ruby looked up at him. "Dad." "Yeah. When I grow up, I want to be like him." The words hit Forge somewhere unexpected. Not in the chest where most things landed, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere he didn't have armor. "Like him," he repeated. "The kind of person who moves," Ruby said, "when everybody else just watches." Forge looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he reached out and smoothed her hair with a hand that had broken more things than it had fixed, but that touched her head like it was the most delicate thing in the world. "You already are," he said. Ruby smiled small and tired and rested her cheek on her arms again. Her eyes drifted back to Ethan's face. She began humming again, the same soft lullaby, the notes barely more than breath. Around them, the clubhouse settled into its nighttime rhythm. Voices, low music, lower the occasional scrape of a chair or clink of glass. Men moved in and out, some on errands related to the search for Trent and Decker. Others just restless with the particular energy that filled a room when something significant had happened and the consequences were still unfolding. Forge sat at the table and waited. He was good at waiting. It was a skill the streets had taught him long before the club had given it structure. You waited for the right moment to move the right opening, to speak the right silence to fill. You waited because patience was a kind of power, and power was the only currency the world reliably accepted. He waited for Ethan to open his eyes. Ethan woke to the sound of someone swearing quietly above him. The ceiling was the first thing he saw. Yellowed, cracked, lit by a single buzzing strip light that hummed like something alive. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was back in the apartment on 7th Street, the burned one where water stains on the ceiling had formed shapes he used to name late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Then he tried to move, and the world reminded him exactly where he was. Pain arrived from every direction simultaneously. His ribs burned with a deep structural ache that turned every breath into a negotiation. His jaw throbbed with a pulse of its own, separate from his heartbeat, as if a second angrier heart had taken up residence in the side of his face. His right hand felt like it had been closed in a door. Twice. A groan escaped before he could choke it back. "Easy, kid." A deep voice somewhere to his right. "You start thrashing, I'm going to have to hold you down, and nobody wants that." Ethan blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. He was lying on a sturdy wooden table, someone's leather jacket folded under his head. The room around him was dim but alive. Walls plastered with flags and old photographs, shelves stacked with bottles and tools, a heavy bar running along one side. Low music played from somewhere he couldn't see. The air smelled like smoke and engine oil and something antiseptic, sharp and clean, beneath the rougher smells. This was not a hospital. This was not a shelter. This was not any of the places a 12-year-old boy was supposed to wake up. A big man with gray threaded through his beard leaned over him, pressing a cloth to his cheek. His arms were inked solid designs running from wrist to shoulder in overlapping waves of black and color. But his hands were steady, almost gentle. "There you are," the man said. "Thought you might sleep through the fun part." "Where am I?" Ethan rasped. "Somewhere you're lucky to be," the man replied. "Name's Sawbones. Doesn't make me a doctor, but I'll keep you breathing." Memories lurched back in jagged pieces. The alley, the punches, a girl's voice, the thunder of engines, a giant called Brick lifting him into the sky. Headlights, then darkness. His body tensed. "Ruby," he croaked. "Where's Ruby?" "Right here." Her small voice came from his left. Ethan turned his head, carefully wincing as the movement sent a fresh pulse through his jaw. Ruby sat on a bar stool pulled close to the table legs, swinging nervously above the floor. A bandage wrapped around one of her knees. Her hair was brushed now, her face clean, but her eyes were still rimmed red. "You scared me," she said. "You were out for a long time." He managed a weak half smile. "You're okay." She nodded quickly. "Dad found me, and then we found you." "Dad." The word pulled Ethan's gaze past her. Forge stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, watching with the focused attention of someone who was deciding something important, but hadn't decided it yet. The strip light carved hard shadows over his features, but his eyes were clear and calculating. Ethan swallowed. "Why am I here?" he asked. Forge stepped closer, boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. "Because the street is not where a kid should be bleeding out after taking hits for my daughter," he said. "And because leaving you there would have made me something worse than what people already think I am." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed against Ethan's chest in a way that had nothing to do with bruised ribs. Sawbones dabbed a stinging liquid on one of the cuts on Ethan's face. "Hold still," he muttered. "You want to keep your face in one piece? Don't flinch." Ethan hissed as the burn flared, but forced himself not to jerk away. He had been hurt before. This was different. This was someone hurting him to help him, and the distinction was so unfamiliar that his body didn't quite know how to respond. "Ribs aren't broken." Sawbones reported more to Forge than to Ethan. "Deep bruises. Hand might have a small fracture in the fourth metacarpal, but I've seen worse. He'll hurt for a while, but he's not dying tonight." "Tonight," Ethan repeated under his breath. Forge caught it. "You think beyond tonight much, kid." Ethan stared at the ceiling. "Not really," he said honestly. Ruby shifted on her stool. "He doesn't have anywhere to go," she blurted. "He lives on the street." Ethan flushed. The heat crawled up his neck and into his face, mixing with the ache of the bruises. He was suddenly painfully aware of how dirty his clothes were against their clean jacket, how his fingernails were rimmed with grime, how he smelled of dumpster steam and days without a shower. "I'm fine," he muttered. "I'll go soon as I can walk." "No," Forge said. The word landed like a stone dropped from a height. Ethan turned his head back toward him. "No," Forge's jaw worked. "You leave here when I say it's safe," he said. "Not before, and right now it's not. Because of them, Trent and Decker." "Word's out," Forge said. "They picked the wrong alley. When scared punks panic, they do stupid things. Might decide you're easier to get to than my kid." Ethan's fingers twitched against the leather beneath him. No one had ever talked about someone coming after him. Before today, nobody had cared enough to consider the possibility. "I don't want trouble," he whispered. You already got it, Forge said. Question is what you do now that it's looking your way. The room hummed with low conversations at its edges, but the center, the table, the boy, the girl and her father existed in its own pocket of silence. Ethan could feel the eyes of other men on him, measuring, assessing, but he kept his gaze on Forge because the man seemed like the kind of person you didn't look away from. Name, Forge asked, even though he clearly already knew. Ethan, Marsh, not that it matters. How long you been on your own? Since last winter. The word after formed in Ethan's mouth, followed by mom, but both words caught in his throat like fishhooks. He bit them back. Got any uncles? Forge asked. A grandma. Anybody who might come looking for you. Ethan shook his head once. If they wanted me, they'd have come before now. Ruby's legs stopped swinging. The stool creaked in the sudden stillness. Why'd you do it? Forge asked. His voice softened a fraction, but the edge remained. It was the voice of a man who wanted the truth and could tell the difference. You don't know her. You don't know me. You had every reason to walk away when you saw trouble in that alley. Ethan stared at his own scraped knuckles. They looked small and pathetic against the scarred wood of the table. He thought about lying, about saying something that sounded noble and rehearsed. But the truth was simpler than that, and it was all he had. They were laughing, he said finally. She was crying. Felt like someone should do something. Someone, Forge repeated. Yeah. Ethan's fingers curled slightly. Nobody did when it was me. So I figured maybe I could be that someone for her. The words slipped out, raw and unplanned, and the moment they were in the air, Ethan wanted to pull them back. He had said too much. He had opened a door that he kept shut for a reason. Forge's expression changed. It was subtle, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching for it, but it was there. A softening around the eyes, a loosening of the muscles in his jaw. Recognition. What happened when it was you? Forge asked. Heat crept up Ethan's neck. He looked away toward the wall plastered with old photos of men and bikes in faded rows. Doesn't matter, he muttered. In this room it does. Ethan swallowed hard. The memories came up like things dredged from deep water. Heavy cold dripping with the weight of having been pushed down for too long. Couple of older kids, he said slowly. After Mom died, they knew I was alone, took my bag, thought it was funny to dump my stuff in a puddle, kicked me around a bit. His chest tightened. People watched. Nobody moved. Silence. I decided, Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper, that if I ever saw it happen to someone smaller than me, I'd move. Ruby's hand crept onto the edge of the table close to his bandaged fingers. Not touching, just there. You did, she whispered. You moved. He risked a glance at her and saw tears shining again, but they weren't falling. She was holding them the way you hold a cup that's too full, carefully with both hands, refusing to spill. Forge straightened. He took a slow breath, the kind that carries the weight of a decision being made. The door banged open. Harlan strode in, face-tight, phone in hand. We got Decker, he said. Found him running his mouth at the gas station on 9th, bragging to his friends like this was some kind of game. Brick and 2 others are bringing him in now. The room shifted. Conversation stopped. Men straightened from walls and bar stools in instinctive response to the changing current. And Trent? Forge asked. In the wind, Harlan said. But it won't last. Half the city's seen the video. He's got nowhere to go that we won't find him. Forge nodded slowly. He looked at Ruby, then at Ethan, then at the door. Bring Decker through the front, he said. No back doors. I want him to see every face in this room. The wait lasted 23 minutes. In that time, Sawbones finished his work wrapping Ethan's ribs with a bandage tight enough to contain the pain, but loose enough to let him breathe. Ruby stayed on her stool, quiet and watchful, her small body vibrating with a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. Ethan pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the protest of every bruised muscle in his body. He refused to be lying down for this. The door opened. Decker stumbled inside, hands zip-tied in front of him, flanked by Brick and another patch member whose name Ethan didn't know. The music, which had been playing low, was cut. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. Decker looked smaller without the alley around him. His bravado had been stripped during the ride over his hair, disheveled, a scratch on his cheek from what might have been a brief, unsuccessful attempt to run. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the photos, the bar, the table, and then with a visible flinch on Ethan. Ethan sat upright on the table, bandaged and swollen, Ruby standing beside him with her hand resting on the wood. Together they looked like something out of a painting Ethan had seen once in a library book. A wounded soldier with a small angel at his side. Absurd and impossible and entirely real. Decker's face drained of color. Forge stepped out from the back of the room. He moved slowly, deliberately, each footstep landing with the precision of someone who understood the theater of power. He stopped a few feet from Decker. "You know who I am," he said. Decker swallowed. "Yeah, Forge." "You know who she is?" Forge asked, nodding toward Ruby. Decker risked a glance. Ruby's stare hit harder than any fist. "Your daughter," he whispered. "And him." Forge tilted his chin toward Ethan. Decker's gaze flinched toward the table. "Just some street kid," he muttered. The room bristled. A low sound moved through the men like wind through tall grass. "Wrong answer," Brick said under his breath. Forge's eyes went cold. "That street kid put his body between you and my daughter," he said. "He took every hit you didn't have the guts to take from someone your own size." Decker's mouth opened, then closed. Sweat formed along his hairline and slid down his temple. Forge stepped closer. "Explain it to me," he said. "Step by step. What made you lay hands on a 7-year-old girl? What made you think my name was something you could throw around to scare her?" Decker's eyes flitted around the room, looking for a way out that did not exist. "It was Trent's idea," he blurted. "He was angry about his brother. We were just messing with her. We didn't know it would go like this." Forge moved so fast the room barely had time to breathe. He fisted a hand in Decker's shirt and slammed him back against the support pillar. The wood groaned. Decker's feet scrabbled for grip. "You didn't know," Forge repeated, voice dangerously calm. "You didn't know that terrorizing a child has consequences. You didn't think that some names aren't toys. We weren't going to really hurt her," Decker stammered. "We just wanted to scare her." "You did," a voice said from behind Forge. "Ruby." She stepped forward past her father, past the ring of silent men, and stopped directly in front of Decker. She was barely 3 feet tall. He had half a foot on her, even slumped against the pillar. But the power dynamic in that room was not determined by height. "You did hurt me," Ruby said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "You grabbed me. You pushed me into the wall. You ripped my bag. And when he," she pointed at Ethan without looking away from Decker, "told you to stop, you laughed." Decker couldn't meet her eyes. Then Ruby asked the question that changed the room. "Do you have a little sister?" Decker blinked. The question was so unexpected that it cut through his panic like a blade. "What, a sister?" Ruby repeated. "Do you have one?" Decker's throat bobbed. "Yeah," he said, barely audible. "She's 5. If someone grabbed her in an alley," Ruby said, "if someone twisted her arm and ripped her bag and laughed while she cried, would you want somebody to stand up for her?" Decker's eyes filled. He tried to blink it away, tried to hold the mask in place, but Ruby's question had found the seam in his armor and driven itself in. His lip trembled. "Yeah," he whispered. "I would." "That's what he did," Ruby said, pointing at Ethan again. "He didn't know me. He didn't know my dad. He just heard me crying and he came. And you laughed while your friend broke his ribs." The silence in the room was absolute. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of 30 people holding their breath at the same time. Forge watched his daughter with an expression that mixed pride with something raw, a kind of grief for the innocence she was spending in this moment, trading it in for something harder and more real. 7 years old, and she was standing in a room full of grown men doing what none of them could. She was reaching the boy's conscience with nothing but a question and the truth. Ruby stepped back. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at the men. She walked back to the table, climbed onto her stool, and put her hand on the wood next to Ethan's again. Ethan stared at her. He had seen adults negotiate, threaten, bargain, and bluff. He had never seen anyone do what Ruby had just done. She had made Decker see his own sister in her face, and in doing so, she had stripped away every excuse and every justification until all that was left was a boy who knew he had done something terrible. Forge released Decker's shirt, letting him sag against the pillar. He stepped back, giving the room its air again. "Ethan, you're the one who took the beating. You tell me, what do you think should happen to him?" The room held its breath again. Ethan felt all those eyes swing to him. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't imagined a world where anyone, much less a man like Forge, would ask his opinion about justice. He looked at Decker. Really looked. Under the shaking and the fierce foam, he saw another kid. A kid who had never had to pay for what he'd done. Who thought the world was soft because it hadn't hit him back yet. But also a kid with a 5-year-old sister at home. A kid whose eyes had filled when Ruby asked that question. "I don't want him hurt like me," Ethan said slowly. A low murmur rippled through the room. Forge raised an eyebrow. "No." Ethan shook his head. "Breaking him just makes another guy who hates people like us more," he said. Then he goes out and finds someone smaller to take it out on. The word us slipped out before he could stop it. Ruby caught it. Her eyes widened slightly, and a small, fierce light came into them. Forge caught it, too. "What do you want, then?" Forge asked. Ethan took a breath that stung all the way down. "I want him to know he didn't just scare a kid today," he said. "He scared a girl who has people who ride for her, and he hit a boy who didn't stay down." His voice shook, but he kept going. "Make him fix what he broke. Make him walk past the kids he used to push and know they're safe because of us, not scared because of him." Forge studied Ethan for a long, heavy moment. Then he turned to Decker. "You're going to work," Forge said. "Every weekend, every spare hour. You're going to clean streets, haul boxes at the food pantry we support, pick up trash around that school you turned into your playground. You're going to do it wearing a plain jacket with no patch. But everyone there will know exactly why you're there." Decker's mouth opened. "That's it." Forge's eyes flashed. "That's the start. You skip once you mouth off, once you touch another kid for the wrong reason, and this conversation changes." Decker swallowed his next words. "And every time you show up," Forge added, "you'll remember there's a boy half your size who had more spine in his worst moment than you've shown in your best." He nodded toward Brick. "Cut him loose, but don't take your eyes off him. Not for a month." Brick moved forward, slicing the zip ties with a quick flick of a knife. Decker flinched, rubbing his raw wrists. "Go home," Forge said. "Tell whoever raised you what you almost cost them today." Decker hesitated, mouth working around words that couldn't find their shape. In the end, he just nodded and let Brick guide him out. Past the silent ring of men, under Ruby's burning stare, past Ethan's bruised but unbroken gaze. The door shut behind him. The tension didn't vanish. It shifted, like weather changing, still heavy, but moving in a new direction. Forge turned back to the table. "You didn't pick vengeance," he said to Ethan. "I picked something I wish someone had picked for me," Ethan said quietly. Forge exhaled. "You got a place here as long as you want it. Not because you're a charity case. Because you proved something most grown men never do." Ethan blinked. "What place?" Forge glanced at Ruby, then back. "The kind that doesn't disappear when the fight's over. A bed, meals, people who know your name when you walk in the door." Ruby's face lit up. "Does that mean It means," Forge said, cutting her off gently but not denying it, "that nobody puts a hand on him in this city without thinking about who stands behind him now." Ethan stared at him, stunned. The words didn't make sense in his head, not because they were complicated, but because they described a world he had stopped believing existed. A world where someone said stay and meant it. A world where the door closed behind you to keep bad things out instead of locking you in. The night deepened around the clubhouse. Men drifted to their posts and their conversations. Sawbones gave Ethan a final check, adjusted his bandages, and handed him 2 white pills with a glass of water. "Pain's going to get worse before it gets better," Sawbones said. "These'll take the edge off. Don't be a hero about it." Ethan took the pills. They were the first medicine he'd had in 8 months. Ruby pulled a blanket from somewhere, one of the thick wool ones that smelled like leather and campfire smoke. She draped it over Ethan's legs and then sat back on her stool, legs crossed, chin on her arms. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "you're going to tell me everything. Where you used to sleep, and what your favorite food is, and what your mom was like. And I'm going to tell you all the stuff Dad's too grumpy to say about himself." Ethan managed a small, real smile. "Okay, tomorrow." Ruby smiled back. Then her face grew serious again, the way children's faces do when they're about to say something they've been thinking about for a long time. "Ethan, yeah, you're not going anywhere, right?" He looked at the ceiling, at the cracked plaster, and the buzzing light, and the strange, impossible warmth of a room full of dangerous men who had decided he mattered. Right, he said. But somewhere between that word and sleep, a shadow crossed his mind. A shape he couldn't name but could feel the way you feel a storm before the sky shows it. The feeling that something this good, something this unexpected always came with a cost. And the bill hadn't arrived yet. Hours passed, Ethan slept. Ruby dozed on her stool, head pillowed on her arms, one hand still resting on the table near his. Forge sat in his chair at the end of the room. Boots on the floor, eyes open, a man keeping watch over two children who had found each other in the worst possible way. Sometime after midnight, the door opened. Voss walked in. He was older than most of the men in the club, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by something harsher than time. Silver hair cropped close, cold blue eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow. He wore his cut like a uniform, every patch earned, every stitch a credential. He had been with the chapter longer than anyone except Forge, and he carried that seniority like a weapon he was always polishing. Voss looked at the table, at the sleeping home, at the girl curled on her stool, then he looked at Forge. A word, Voss said. It wasn't a request. Forge rose without hurry and followed Voss to the far end of the bar, where the light was dimmer and the music covered their voices. You want to explain what I'm looking at? Voss said, voice low and flat. A kid who took a beating for Ruby, Forge said. A street kid, Voss corrected. A nobody, and you've got him sleeping on our table like he's one of us. Forge's eyes were steady. He bled for my daughter. That's not nobody. Voss leaned against the bar. Today he bled for her. Tomorrow he's a liability. A kid with no background, no family, no one to vouch for him. You bring him in here, word gets out that Forge went soft, that this chapter takes in strays. We've taken in strays before, Forge said. That's how most of us got here. Most of us earned our place. He earned his in an alley. Voss shook his head slowly. One fight doesn't make him family. One beating doesn't buy him a chair at this table. You're thinking with your heart instead of your head, and that's how chapters fall apart. Forge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Voss, I've respected you since the day I rode my first mile, but you don't get to tell me what my daughter's safety is worth. This isn't about your daughter. This is about what this club stands for. Then what does it stand for? We protect our own. That boy protected mine before he knew what own meant. If that doesn't count, then what does? Voss studied him for a long moment, something working behind those cold blue eyes. Then he straightened, set his glass on the bar, and walked toward the door. I've said my piece, Voss said over his shoulder. Don't say I didn't warn you. The door closed behind him. Forge stood at the bar, one hand flat on the scarred wood jaw tight. He had expected resistance. He had not expected it to come from Voss, who had been his most reliable ally for a decade. The fracture was small hairline, barely visible. But fractures had a way of growing. He walked back to the table. Ethan was still asleep, but his brow was furrowed, his body curling tighter under the blanket, as if bracing against a cold that wasn't there. Ruby hadn't moved. Her breathing was slow and even, the deep breathing of a child who felt safe enough to let go. Forge sat down and watched them both. Two children, one his by blood, one his by something harder to name but no less binding. The night pressed against the windows, and inside the clubhouse under the buzzing light, the silence held steady. But it was the kind of silence that comes before. The next morning, Ethan tried to leave. He woke before dawn, the old habit of street survival pulling him from sleep like a hand on his collar. The clubhouse was dark and quiet. Ruby was asleep on a makeshift bed someone had assembled from cushions near the table. Forge's chair was empty. Ethan slid off the table. The pain was immediate and comprehensive, ribs, hand, jaw, registering their complaints in a chorus of sharp notes. He ignored them. He had moved through pain before. Pain was just the body's way of saying pay attention, and he was paying attention to something else entirely. Voss's words, spoken hours earlier when he thought the room was asleep, had traveled through the dark like smoke. A nobody. A liability. Forge went soft. Ethan had heard those kinds of words before. Not about him specifically, but about people like him. Street people. Invisible people. The kind whose presence was tolerated until it became inconvenient, and then the tolerance evaporated like water on hot pavement. He wasn't going to be the reason this man's family fractured. He wasn't going to be the kraken in the wall. He moved quietly toward the door, stepping over empty bottles and around chair legs, with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to move through occupied spaces without being noticed. His hand was on the door handle when a voice behind him stopped his heart. "Where are you going, Ruby?" Standing in the dark in pajamas someone had found for her, two big sleeves rolled bare feet on the cold floor. Her hair was tangled from sleep, and her eyes were wide and fierce in the dim light from the exit sign. "Go back to sleep," Ethan whispered. "You're leaving." "I have to." "Why?" Ethan's hand tightened on the door handle. "Because I heard what that man said." "Voss, he's right. I don't belong here. I'm going to make things harder for your dad." Ruby walked toward him, bare feet padding on the concrete. She stopped directly in front of the door between him and the exit and folded her arms. The gesture was so small and so fierce that Ethan felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with bruised ribs. "Move," he said, but there was no force behind it. "No," Ruby said. The word hung between them. The same word Ethan had used in the alley. The same word that had cost him blood and pain and very nearly his consciousness. Coming from a 7-year-old in oversized pajamas, it carried a different kind of weight. The weight of someone who had learned it from watching him. "If you leave," Ruby said, "I'm going with you." "You can't do that." "Watch me." "Ruby, you stood in front of me when you didn't have to. Now I'm standing in front of you. That's how it works." The door behind Ethan was cold against his back. The night beyond it was colder. He knew what waited out there. Concrete and wind, and the particular loneliness of a city that had already decided he didn't exist. He looked at Ruby's face, determined, terrified, and absolutely unwilling to move. Heavy footsteps behind them. Forge's silhouette filled the hallway, backlit by the dim glow of the bar's emergency light. He took in the scene without speaking, his daughter barefoot blocking the door. The boy, half-dressed in borrowed clothes, hand on the handle, frozen between going and staying. "Rain's coming," Forge said. His voice was quiet, conversational, as if this were a normal moment in a normal house. "You planning to walk out into that with cracked ribs and no shoes?" Ethan looked down. He realized he wasn't wearing shoes. Someone had taken them off while he slept, probably sawbones, to check his feet for injuries. "I heard Voss," Ethan said. "He doesn't want me here." "Voss doesn't get to decide who's under my roof," Forge said. "He's going to cause problems for you." "Voss has been causing problems for me since before you were born. That's what he does. It doesn't change what I've decided." Ethan's hand slipped from the door handle. "Why?" he asked. The question was barely a sound. "Why do you care?" Forge walked forward until he stood in front of both of them. He looked at Ethan the way he had looked at him in the alley. Not with pity, with recognition. "Because I was you," Forge said. 12 years old. No family, no home. Sleeping behind a machine shop, eating out of trash cans. A man named Wallace found me after I got into a fight defending a kid I didn't know. He didn't ask if I deserved to be saved. He just brought me home and said the food's here either way." Ethan's throat tightened. "Wallace gave me a chance nobody else would," Forge said. "He didn't do it because I earned it. He did it because he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself yet. And I'm looking at you right now, kid, and I see the same damn thing." Ruby looked between them, tears sliding down her cheeks, but she was smiling. The impossible combination of sadness and joy that only children and the bravest adults can hold at the same time. Forge put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, heavy, warm, and steady. "Come back inside," he said, "and the food's here either way." Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment. The rain had started just as Forge predicted, a soft, steady drumming on the pavement outside, the kind of rain that washes things clean. He stepped back from the door. Ruby took his hand, small fingers wrapping around his bandaged ones with a gentleness that made his eyes burn. They walked back inside together. The door closed behind them. The rain fell. The confrontation with Voss came 2 days later, and it came publicly the way Voss wanted it. The chapter held weekly meetings at the long table, a tradition older than most of the men who sat around it. These meetings were where decisions were made, disputes settled, and the business of the club conducted with a formality that would have surprised anyone who only saw the leather and tattoos from the outside. Ethan was in the back room when it started, lying on the cot Brick had set up for him, reading a paperback novel Ruby had brought from school. His ribs were still wrapped, his hands splinted with a makeshift brace Seabones had fashioned from a ruler and medical tape. Ruby sat on the floor beside him, drawing on a pad of paper, her tongue poking out the way it did when she was concentrating. They heard Voss's voice through the wall, not the words not at first, but the tone. The tone of a man who had chosen his ground and intended to hold it. Then the voices got louder. This chapter has rules, Voss was saying, rules that have kept us alive and strong for 40 years. One of those rules is that we don't take in strays off the street because our hearts get soft. Nobody's heart is soft, Forge replied, his voice level. This is a strategic decision. Strategic, you bring a 12-year-old boy into a clubhouse full of men who have rap sheets longer than his whole life. You put him 20 feet from conversations he has no business hearing. You introduce a weakness into this house, and you call it strategic, murmurs from the other men, not taking sides, not yet. Ruby's crayon stopped moving. She looked at Ethan. Ethan stared at the ceiling. I should go, he said. Shut up, Ruby said, which was the first time she had ever said those words to anyone, and she was mildly shocked at herself. But she didn't take them back. She stood up, put down her crayon, and walked out of the back room. Ethan sat up, wincing. Ruby, don't. But she was already through the door. The main room went quiet when she appeared. 30 men around the table, beer bottles and notebooks and scarred wood, all of them turning to look at the 7-year-old girl who had walked into the middle of their meeting with bare feet and a crayon still tucked behind her ear. Voss straightened. This is club business, Ruby. Go back to... You said we don't take in strays, Ruby said. Her voice was clear and steady. The room seemed to shrink around it. Voss looked at Forge, expecting intervention. Forge leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said nothing. His eyes were on his daughter, and there was something in them that said, go ahead. You said the club has rules about who belongs here, Ruby continued. You said bringing Ethan in makes us weak. Ruby, Voss started, you told my dad that this club stands for something, that we protect our own. She stepped forward past men who parted for her without thinking. Ethan bled for this club's family before he knew this club existed. He stood in front of me when nobody else was there. Not you, not anyone at this table. A boy who doesn't even have shoes that match. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. You say family is the most important thing. You say loyalty is everything. You say those words every single meeting. But when a boy shows up who already proved all of that with his own body, you want to throw him out because he doesn't have a patch. Voss's jaw worked. His cold blue eyes were fixed on her face, but something behind them was shifting. You ask when Ethan earned his place, Ruby said. He earned it in the same alley where I almost lost mine. And he didn't even know what he was earning. He just knew I was crying. She stopped, out of breath, cheeks flushed, hand balled at her sides. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like gunshots. Voss looked around the table. Every face he met looked back at him with expressions that ranged from neutral to pointed. Not hostile, not exactly, but settled. Decided. He looked at Forge. Forge looked back at him the way the earth looks at the rain. Patient, unmoved. The girl's got your mouth, Voss said quietly. She's got her own, Forge replied. Voss stood still for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sound that carried the weight of something being set down after being held for too long. Fine, he said. The kid stays, but he's your responsibility. Anything goes wrong, it's on you. It was always on me, Forge said. Voss nodded once sharply and sat down. He picked up his beer and drank, and the meeting continued as if nothing had happened, which was the club's way of saying that everything had. Ruby turned and walked back toward the back room. As she passed Forge's chair, he reached out and caught her hand. He squeezed it once briefly, then let go. She kept walking. Ethan was standing in the doorway when she got there. He had heard everything. You didn't have to do that, he said. Ruby looked at him with an expression that was old beyond her years and young beyond his understanding. Yeah, she said. I did. It was the same answer he had given her in the alley. He recognized it. She recognized that he recognized it. And something passed between them in that moment that was stronger than either of them could name, a bond that had been forged in blood and tears, in the simple, terrifying act of standing between someone and the thing trying to hurt them. They went back to their corner. Ruby picked up her crayon. Ethan picked up his book. Outside, the city moved and hummed and went about its business, unaware that inside a squat brick building, behind a row of shuttered shops, two children had just rearranged the foundations of a world that was older and harder than both of them combined. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Ethan had never experienced. Meals at regular times, a bed that stayed in the same place every night, a door he could close, hot water, soap, a toothbrush still in its packaging handed to him by Sawbones with the gruff instruction to use it twice a day or lose his teeth by 30. Forge enrolled him in Ruby's school. The paperwork required creative interpretation. Guardianship forms signed with the kind of authority that no one in the district office was inclined to question. But within a week, Ethan Marsh was sitting in a classroom for the first time in nearly a year, wearing clothes that fit and shoes that matched. Ruby appointed herself his guide, walking him through the hallways, introducing him to her friends with the proprietary pride of someone who has acquired something precious and wants the world to acknowledge it. "This is Ethan," she would say. "He's my brother." The word hit Ethan like sunlight after a long tunnel every single time. He never corrected her. The clubhouse adjusted to his presence with the gruff efficiency of an organization that had absorbed unexpected elements before. Brick took on the unofficial role of making sure Ethan ate breakfast every morning, setting a plate in front of him, with the same silent determination he applied it to everything else. Harlan, who had a daughter roughly Ethan's age in another city, occasionally left books on his cot paperbacks, with dog-eared pages and someone else's name written inside the front cover. Sawbones checked his ribs every evening, poking and prodding with clinical detachment, while muttering about 12-year-olds with the self-preservation instincts of lemmings. Even Voss, after his defeat at the hands of a 7-year-old, maintained a careful neutrality. He didn't warm to Ethan, but he stopped arguing against his presence. When Ethan walked through the main room, Voss would acknowledge him with a slight nod, which was in the vocabulary of the chapter roughly equivalent to a handshake and a smile. Ruby taught Ethan to draw. He had no talent for it. His horses looked like dogs and his dogs looked like potatoes. But she was patient in the fierce, exasperated way of all good teachers. By the end of the second week, he could manage a passable horse. She taped it to the wall of the back room and declared it a masterpiece. Ethan taught Ruby to read a room. Not the way adults do with politics and subtext, but the way the street does. Who's nervous? Who's lying? Who's about to move? It wasn't a lesson he had planned, but Ruby was a natural observer, and when he pointed out the way Sawbones always touched his left ear before delivering bad news, or the way Brick's voice dropped half an octave when he was genuinely angry versus when he was joking, she absorbed it like water into sand. "You're teaching my daughter to be a spy," Forge said one evening, not entirely displeased. "I'm teaching her to pay attention," Ethan replied. Forge grunted, which was his version of approval. But beneath the surface of this new life, a current ran that Ethan could feel even when he couldn't see it. Trent was still out there. The video had made the rounds and faded as videos do, replaced by newer outrages and fresher scandals. But the people who mattered hadn't forgotten. Forge's men kept a rotation near the school, always one or two within sight of the gates. Harlan's network of informants, shop owners, and bartenders, and the old women who sat on porches and missed nothing stayed alert. Trent had gone to ground. But going to ground was not the same as going away. And Decker, to everyone's quiet surprise, was showing up. Every weekend, plain jacket, no patch hauling, boxes at the food pantry on South Street, picking up trash in the park near the school. He didn't speak much. He didn't smile. But he came and he worked, and when he passed Ethan on the street one afternoon, he stopped. "Hey," Decker said. Ethan tensed. I wanted to say, Decker started, then stopped, his face twisting with the effort of saying something he hadn't practiced. "My sister asked me why I'm doing community service." I told her the truth. She cried. She said she was glad somebody stood up for that girl. Ethan said nothing. "I'm trying," Decker said. "That's all." He walked away. Ethan watched him go and felt something he hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But the absence of hatred, which was close enough. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The bruises faded. The fracture in Ethan's hand healed into a dull ache that only appeared on cold mornings. He started to gain weight, his face filling out the sharp angles of hunger, softening into something that looked for the first time in months like a child. Ethan taught Ruby how to move quickly in tight spaces without tripping, how to spot exits in any room, how to scream in a way that carried not the high squeal of panic, but the deep diaphragmatic shout that Brick had demonstrated for him one afternoon in the clubhouse parking lot. Self-defense, Ethan called it. Not fighting, never fighting. Just the art of buying time until someone bigger arrived. Ruby practiced her scream until Sawbones threatened to confiscate her vocal cords. She practiced her exits until she could identify 3 escape routes in any room in under 5 seconds. She practiced her awareness until the act of reading a room became as natural as reading a book, something she did without thinking, a sixth sense that lived in the corners of her eyes. The piece held. It held the way a bridge holds when the weight on it is evenly distributed, functional, reliable, but not built to withstand a sudden shift. And the shift was coming. Ethan could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes, in the vibrations beneath the surface, in the quality of the silence between conversations. A tension in the way the corner store owner glanced over his shoulder. A change in the patrol patterns of Forge's men, tighter, more focused, as if the perimeter was shrinking. A phone call Harlan took at 2 in the morning that left his face gray and his coffee untouched. Something was coming. The morning it happened started like any other. Ethan walked Ruby to school the way he always did, the two of them moving through the neighborhood in the easy rhythm they had developed over the past 3 weeks. Ruby talked the entire way, a continuous stream of observations about clouds, teachers, the suspicious behavior of the class hamster, and a theory she had been developing about why Sawbones pretended to be grumpy when he was actually the kindest man in the clubhouse. Ethan listened the way he always did, with half his attention on her words and the other half on the street. Old habits, the kind that kept you alive when you didn't have walls around you. Even now, with a roof over his head and food in his stomach, the street part of his brain stayed switched on, scanning doorways, tracking movement at the edges of his vision, cataloging every car that passed twice. It was this part of his brain that noticed the van. It was a dark blue work van, the kind with no windows in the back, parked across the street from the school. Nothing remarkable about it in isolation. But Ethan had walked this route every school day for 3 weeks, and that van had never been there before. And the man in the driver's seat was not reading a phone or eating a sandwich or doing any of the things people do when they're legitimately parked. He was watching the school gates. Ethan filed it away. He didn't say anything to Ruby. Not yet. He walked her to the gates, watched her disappear through the double doors with a wave and a smile that still made something ache in his chest every time. And then he stood on the sidewalk and looked at the van again. The driver's eyes met his, just for a second. Then the van pulled away from the curb and turned the corner. Ethan pulled out the phone. Forge had given him a basic model, pre-programmed, with 3 numbers, Forge, Brick, and Harlan. He texted Harlan. Blue van, no windows. Parked across from school. Driver watching gates. Gone now. The reply came in 30 seconds. License plate. Ethan kicked himself. He hadn't caught it. Partial only. Started with J7. Good enough. Stay sharp. He spent the school day restless. Something in his chest was tight, a wire being wound, slowly waiting to snap. He sat through his classes the way a soldier sits through a briefing, absorbing what he could, while his mind ran parallel tracks of calculation and contingency. At 3:15, the final bell rang. Ethan was at the gates before the doors opened, positioning himself at the exact spot where he could see every exit and both approaches to the street. Ruby emerged 3 minutes later, backpack bouncing, waving goodbye to friends. The blue van was not there. Ethan checked twice. The street looked normal. Parents in cars, a crossing guard with a fluorescent vest, 2 of Forge's men positioned discreetly, one in a coffee shop window, one leaning against a bike half a block down. Ethan's wire loosened slightly. He met Ruby at the gate. Ready, he said. Always, she said, which was what she said every day, and which never failed to make him feel like the walk home was something worth looking forward to. They took the normal route, down Ashland, right on Cooper, through the park where the old men played chess on concrete tables. Ruby was telling him about a science project involving volcanoes when Ethan felt it again. The wire tightening, the street part of his brain flaring like a signal fire. He stopped walking. Ruby stopped too mid-sentence. She had learned to read him just as he had learned to read rooms. When Ethan stopped, something was wrong. What? She said. He looked around. The park was ordinary. Kids on the swings, a woman walking a dog, The chess players arguing about a bishop. Nothing out of place, but the blue van was parked at the far end of the park. Engine off, no one visible inside. Ruby, Ethan said, his voice low and even. We're going to walk a different way today. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She took his hand and they turned around. They made it 6 steps before the van doors opened. Trent stepped out of the passenger side. He looked different from the boy in the alley. Thinner, darker under the eyes, as if sleep had become something he could no longer afford. 3 weeks of hiding had stripped something from him, the easy arrogance that comes from never having faced consequences. In its place was something harder and more volatile, the concentrated bitterness of a boy who had lost everything and decided it was someone else's fault. Behind him, 2 other boys climbed out, older than Trent by a year or 2, bigger, the kind of boys who had already crossed the line between troubled teenager and something more permanent. They wore the expressions of people who had been promised something in exchange for being here. Miss me, Trent said. Ruby's hand tightened in Ethan's. He could feel her pulse through her fingers, fast and light like a bird's. Ethan's mind raced. 3 of them. 1 of him. Ruby to protect. Forge's men were a block away, maybe 2. Too far to reach before this started. Too far to shout to. He looked at Ruby. Her eyes were wide, but they were focused. The alley had changed her just as it had changed him. She was scared, but she was not frozen. Remember what I taught you, Ethan said quietly. She nodded. Good. On 3 you run, not home, toward the coffee shop on Ashland. That's where Forge's guy is. You scream as loud as you can the entire way. You do not look back. I'm not leaving you, Ruby whispered fiercely. You're not leaving me. You're getting help. That's different. Ruby's jaw tightened. It was Forge's jaw, the same hard set, the same stubborn angle. She didn't like the plan, but she understood it. Getting help was not the same as running away. It was the other half of the fight. Trent was walking toward them, the 2 others fanning out to the sides, cutting off the lateral exits. The chess players looked up, saw what was happening, and looked away. The woman with the 2 changed direction. The playground emptied as parents sensed something shifting in the air and pulled their children close. 3 weeks I've been out there, Trent said, his voice carrying across the open space. 3 weeks eating trash, sleeping in my car because your biker daddy's got the whole city looking for me. And for what? Because I shoved his little princess around. You did more than shove, Ethan said. He kept his voice steady. He kept his body between Trent and Ruby. Same position, same stance, same choice. Trent's eyes fixed on him. You again, he said. I should have hit you harder. You hit plenty hard, Ethan said. I'm still here. Something flashed in Trent's eyes. Frustration, maybe. Or the particular rage of someone who can't understand why the thing they keep hitting won't break. 1, Ethan whispered to Ruby. Ethan, please, 2. Trent broke into a run. The 2 boys behind him surged forward. 3. Ruby ran. She ran the way Ethan had taught her, not away from, but toward safety, toward help, toward the specific coffee shop on Ashland Street, where she knew with the certainty of 3 weeks of observation that one of her father's men sat every afternoon with a clear sightline to the school. And she screamed. The sound split the air like a siren, high and sharp and designed to carry. Not a scream of panic, a scream of purpose. A sound that said something is wrong and I need help now, and I am not asking, I am demanding. Heads turned, windows opened. The crossing guard 2 blocks away looked up. The chess players raised their heads from their frozen game. And in the coffee shop on Ashland, a man with tattooed forearms and a leather cut under his jacket set down his cup and moved. Behind her, Ruby heard the sound of impact. She heard Ethan's voice, sharp and defiant, saying something she couldn't make out. She heard the scuffle of feet and the ugly sound of a fist connecting with flesh. She did not look back. She ran until the coffee shop door was in front of her, and she hit it with both hands, slamming it open so hard that the bell above it flew off its mount and skittered across the counter. They're in the park, she gasped. Trent, 3 of them. They have Ethan. The man was already on his phone, already moving, already calling in the coordinates with the calm efficiency of someone trained for exactly this moment. He put a hand on Ruby's shoulder. Stay here, he said. No, Ruby said. Ruby, I said no. She turned and ran back toward the park. The man swore under his breath and followed, phone still pressed to his ear, because there was no force on earth that could stop a 7-year-old girl from running toward the boy who had bled for her. In the park, Ethan was doing what he had done before. He was standing between violence and a space that Ruby had occupied moments ago, absorbing blows that were meant to reach past him, refusing to move. But this time was different. This time he was not just enduring, he was thinking. 3 weeks of meals had given him strength he hadn't had in the alley. 3 weeks of rest had sharpened his mind. And 3 weeks of watching Forge's men, the way they positioned themselves, the way they controlled space, the way they used angles and walls and the geometry of a room to their advantage, had taught him things that no classroom ever would. When the first boy swung, Ethan didn't try to block it. He sidestepped, letting the momentum carry the boy past him and shoved him into the park bench. The boy's shins caught the edge, and he went down hard, cursing. The second boy came from the right. Ethan ducked low and the fist sailed over his head. He drove his shoulder into the boy's midsection, a move he had seen Brick demonstrate on a heavy bag in the clubhouse's makeshift gym. It wasn't pretty, and it hurt Ethan's ribs more than it hurt the other boy, but it bought him 3 seconds of space. Trent came in fast. His fist caught Ethan across the cheekbone, snapping his head back. Stars exploded. The old pain in his jaw woke up like something that had been sleeping and was now furious. Ethan staggered, caught himself on the back of a bench, and straightened. "Still not moving," he said, blood on his lip. Trent hit him again. Ethan went down on one knee, the world tilting, colors sliding sideways like paint on a wet canvas. The first boy was getting up from behind the bench. The second was circling, 3 against 1, and the one had bruised ribs and a fractured hand that hadn't fully healed. But Ethan didn't need to win. He needed to last. Every second he stayed upright was a second Ruby was running. Every blow he absorbed was a blow that brought help closer. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to delay. And delay was its own kind of victory. The kind that didn't show up on scoreboards but changed the outcome of everything. The first boy kicked at his legs. Ethan rolled, absorbing the impact on his hip instead of his knee, and came up swinging. His fist connected with the boy's jaw, a sloppy, desperate punch that sent a shock of pain through his fractured hand, but also sent the boy reeling backward, surprised that the street kid could hit back. Trent grabbed Ethan's shirt and slammed him against the park's chain-link fence. The metal dug into his back, pressing against his bruised ribs with a white-hot insistence that made his vision swim. Trent's face was inches from his, twisted with rage and something Ethan had not expected to see. Fear. Trent was afraid, not of Ethan, of what came after, of the engines, of the men, of the name that he had been running from for 3 weeks. And that fear was making him desperate, and desperate was worse than cruel because cruel had limits, and desperate did not. "You took everything from me," Trent hissed. "You and that girl. My brother's gone. My life's gone. And you're sitting in their clubhouse eating their food like you belong there." "I didn't take anything," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "You came into that alley. You grabbed a 7-year-old girl. That's on you." "My brother never hurt anyone," Trent said, but the words sounded rehearsed hollow, like a song someone had sung so many times the meaning had worn away. "Ask Forge," Ethan managed. "Ask him what your brother really did." Trent's fist drew back, and then a voice cut through the park like a blade. "Hey, Decker." He came around the corner of the recreation building at a run, wearing his plain jacket, no patch of garbage bag in one hand from his community service shift. His face was flushed, his eyes wide, his body moving with the kind of adrenaline that comes from seeing something you can't walk away from. Not anymore. "Trent, stop," Decker shouted. Trent turned, fist still cocked, disbelief and betrayal warring on his face. "Are you serious right now?" Decker didn't slow down. He hit Trent from the side, not gracefully, not skillfully, just the blunt impact of one body colliding with another. They went down together in a tangle of limbs on the park grass. The garbage bag burst open, scattering crumpled cans and napkins across the ground. The other 2 boys hesitated. They looked at each other, at Decker wrestling with Trent on the grass, at Ethan pushing himself off the fence with blood on his face and fire in his eyes. They looked at the streets beyond the park, where the sound of engines had just become audible, distant but growing the way it had grown in the alley 3 weeks ago. They made their decision. They ran. They ran the way rabbits run from eagles, without thought, without direction, just pure atavistic flight. They made it 30 feet before two of Forge's men cut them off bikes sliding to a stop in their path, blocking the exit with chrome and engine noise and the promise of consequences. Trent shoved Decker off him and scrambled to his feet. He looked at the bikes, at the men dismounting, at the closing circle of leather and ink and cold eyes. He looked for an escape and found none. Forge killed his engine. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, every movement carrying the weight of a man who had been waiting for this moment and intended to use every second of it. His boots hit the ground with the sound of a gavel. Ruby appeared from behind the line of bikes. She had followed them back, running behind the convoy, and now she pushed through the ring of men and into the open space at the center. Her eyes found Ethan immediately. He was on his feet, barely leaning against the fence, blood on his face, chest heaving. She ran to him. "You're bleeding again," she said, half angry, half relieved. "I know," he said. "You screamed really loud." "I practiced," she said. Despite everything, despite the blood and the fear and the trembling in both their hands, they smiled at each other. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it contained the entire story of the past 3 weeks, every drawing lesson and every breakfast and every moment of belonging that two children had shared in a world that hadn't expected them to find each other. Behind them, Forge walked toward Trent. The boy stood in the center of the closing circle, chest heaving, eyes wild. Decker was on the ground nearby, sitting up slowly, touching a cut on his own forehead from where Trent had caught him during the struggle. Forge stopped in front of Trent. He said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched out like a wire, thin and taut and vibrating with potential energy. Every man in the circle understood that this silence was not absence. It was presence, the concentrated weight of a man deciding how much of his power to use. 3 weeks, Forge said finally. 3 weeks you've been hiding, planning, recruiting help to come after a 7-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy. Trent's chin jutted out, but the defiance was hollow, a shell over something crumbling. "You want to know what your brother did to get thrown out of this city?" Forge continued. His voice was even, almost conversational. "He sold drugs to a 13-year-old girl who ended up in the hospital. He used my territory to do it, and when I confronted him, he pulled a knife. I gave him a choice most people in his position don't get. Leave or stop leaving under his own power." Trent's face changed. The anger flickered, replaced by something more complicated. Confusion, then doubt, then the slow, nauseating recognition of someone who has just realized that the story they've been living inside might not be the true one. "He didn't tell you that part, did he?" Forge said. "He told you I threw him out for no reason. Because that's what people like your brother do. They make the world fit their story instead of the other way around." Trent's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to the ground, then back to Forge, then to the ground again. The fight was leaving him not all at once, but in pieces like a wall losing bricks. And instead of asking questions, Forge said, "You came after my daughter, twice. You hurt a girl who never did anything to you. And you beat a boy who has less than nothing and still had more courage than anyone in your crew." Forge looked at Decker, who was getting to his feet. Grass stains on his jacket, blood on his face, standing in the circle, not as an accomplice, but as something else entirely. Someone who had made a choice. The right one. At cost. Except maybe him, Forge added quietly. Decker met his gaze, surprised, and looked away, but his shoulders straightened slightly, and Ethan, watching from the fence, thought he saw something settle into the older boy's frame. The posture of someone who had just discovered that they were capable of more than they'd believed. Forge turned back to Trent. "I could break you," he said simply. "Everyone in this park knows that. You know that. But I've got a 12-year-old kid over there who taught me something about what breaking people actually accomplishes." He stepped close enough that Trent could see the scars on his knuckles, the ink on his arms, the absolute certainty in his eyes. "You're going to turn yourself in to the police," Forge said. "Assault on a minor. Whatever else they want to charge you with. You're going to do it today, and you're going to do it because it's the start of something your brother never had the guts to start. Accountability." Trent's voice was barely a whisper. "And if I don't," Forge's expression didn't change, "then this conversation is the last friendly one you ever have." Trent looked around the circle, at the men with their crossed arms and stone faces, at Decker, who stood apart, bloodied from the fight, watching him with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding, or might have been both. At Ruby, who stood next to Ethan with her hand in his, staring at Trent with the same expression she had worn in the alley. I see you, and I will remember. Trent's shoulders dropped. The defiance drained from his body like water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind only the frame of a boy who had been angry for so long that he had forgotten what the anger was for. Okay, he said. The word was small and broken, but it was real. Not forced, not extracted, but offered. The first honest thing Trent had said in the 3 weeks since the alley, and possibly longer than that. The first step on a road that might lead somewhere worth going, or might lead nowhere at all, but at least led away from here. Brick stepped forward and put a hand on Trent's shoulder. Not roughly, not gently either, just firmly enough to communicate that the decision had been made and the direction of movement was no longer optional. They walked toward the bikes. Forge watched them go. Then he turned to Decker. You showed up, Forge said. Decker rubbed the back of his neck. I was doing trash pickup by the rec building. I heard the noise. I couldn't just... You showed up, Forge repeated. The words carried more weight the second time. They were not an observation. They were a verdict. A mark in a ledger that the club kept in ways that had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with the slow, patient business of deciding who someone really was. Decker nodded slowly, understanding that he was being told something important. That the weeks of community service, the boxes hauled, and the trash collected, and the pride swallowed, had not been for nothing. That the change he had been trying to make, the one that had felt invisible and pointless on the mornings when he showed up to an empty food pantry with nobody watching, had been recorded somewhere. In Ruby's question about his sister, in the look on Ethan's face when he said he was trying, and now in Forge's voice saying the same two words twice. You showed up. Forge turned to his men. Get these two out of here, he said, nodding toward the boys who had been caught at the exit. Take them to the station. Let the cops sort it. Then he walked to where Ruby and Ethan stood against the fence. Ruby still had Ethan's hand. Ethan still had blood on his face. They looked up at him with eyes that held exhaustion and relief and something else, something that looked like the beginning of a peace that didn't depend on the absence of trouble, but on the presence of people who would come when trouble arrived. You're bleeding again, Forge said to Ethan. Everybody keeps saying that, Ethan replied. The corner of Forge's mouth twitched. He crouched down, bringing his face level with theirs. His eyes moved between them, the girl and the boy, the daughter and the found 1-2 children who kept putting themselves between the world's fists and each other. I'm proud of you, he said, both of you. Ruby leaned into his chest. Forge's arm went around her, and she disappeared into the leather and warmth of him, the way she always did, like a small boat finding harbor. Ethan stood very still. The words landed on him like something heavy and warm, like a blanket, like the jacket someone had folded under his head in a dark room when they thought he was sleeping. Nobody had said those words to him since his mother. Nobody had looked at him the way Forge was looking at him now, with an expression that said, you matter, and I see you, and you are not alone, all without using any of those words directly. Forge stood and put a hand on each of their shoulders, one large hand on each small frame, a weight that held them to the earth and simultaneously lifted them above it. Let's go home, he said. The clubhouse was full that night, not for a meeting, not for business, for something else, something that didn't have a name in the club's official vocabulary, but that everyone understood without needing one. Forge stood at the head of the long table, the one scarred with years and decisions, and the residue of lives lived hard and true. His men sat around it, filling every chair, spilling onto stools, and leaning against walls. Brick and Harlan and Sawbones and Voss and all the others, their faces solemn in the warm light of the overhead bulbs that someone had replaced for the occasion, swapping out the buzzing strip lights for something warmer, something that made the room look less like a bunker and more like a place where things could begin. Ruby sat in the chair to Forge's right, legs dangling above the floor, her small presence commanding the space with a gravity that had nothing to do with size. She had changed into a clean shirt, and someone, probably Brick, had brushed her hair and tied it back with a rubber band. She looked serious in the way that 7-year-olds look serious when they understand that something important is happening and they don't want to miss it. Ethan sat beside her. His face was freshly bandaged, courtesy of Sawbones, who had muttered something about frequent flyer programs for battered children while taping a butterfly closure over the newest cut on his cheekbone. His ribs ached, his hand throbbed. But he sat straight and his eyes were clear, and when he looked around the table at the faces of the men who had become, without his permission and without his understanding, closest thing to a family he had known in 8 months, he felt something in his chest that was warm and large and terrifying, in the way that good things are terrifying when you've spent a long time believing you don't deserve them. Forge looked around the table. He took his time. He let the silence build until it had weight and substance, until every man in the room could feel it pressing against his skin. "This club has been through a lot," he said. "We've buried brothers. We've rebuilt from nothing. We've drawn lines in this city and held them when everyone said we couldn't." He paused. "But I didn't build this chapter so we could just hold lines. I built it so we could hold each other." His gaze settled on Ethan. "3 weeks ago, a boy with nothing walked into an alley and stood between my daughter and two people who wanted to hurt her. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who I was. He didn't do it for a patch or a seat at this table or a roof over his head. He did it because a girl was crying and he decided someone should move." Forge's voice was steady, but there was a current beneath it, something that ran deeper than ceremony, deeper than the rituals of a club that had its own language and its own laws. "That boy has slept under this roof. He's eaten at this table. He's bled for this family twice. And every time he's been given a reason to leave, he's stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because someone here made him believe that staying was worth the risk." He looked at Ruby. She looked back at him with eyes that were dreamy and bright and full of something that was bigger than a 7-year-old should have been able to carry, but that she carried anyway, the way she carried everything, with both hands and without complaint. "Ethan Marsh is not a prospect," Forge said. "He's not a recruit. He's not a charity case. From this moment on, in this house, in this city, in this family, he is ours." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through every man at the table, through the smoke-stained air, through the photographs on the walls that showed decades of men who had sat in these same chairs and made these same kinds of decisions. "Not because he earned it in a fight," Forge continued, "but because he taught every man in this room what courage looks like when it doesn't come with a cut on its back. Because my daughter chose him. And because in 30 years of riding, I've never seen anyone, any age, any size, stand the way he stood." He turned to the room. "Anyone here disagree?" The silence was its own answer. It was not the silence of indifference or the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of consensus, the kind that comes when a room full of people who rarely agree on anything find themselves in unanimous agreement about something that matters. Then Voss spoke. The room stiffened slightly, bracing for resistance. It was reflexive. Voss had been the voice of opposition for weeks, and muscle memory expected more of the same. But the old man's face was different tonight. The cold blue eyes were not warm exactly. Voss was not a warm man and never would be. But the ice in them had thawed by a degree enough to let something through that might have been respect, or might have been the grudging acknowledgement of someone who has been proven wrong and is old enough to know that being wrong about the right things is not a weakness. He looked at Ethan, then at Ruby, then at Forge. "The kid stays," Voss said, "and anyone who touches him answers to the chapter." It was from Voss the equivalent of a standing ovation. The room exhaled. Brick grinned the expression, transforming his massive face from something that belonged on a wanted poster to something that belonged on a greeting card. Harlan raised his glass. Sawbones nodded with the brisk satisfaction of a man whose patient had finally taken his advice. One by one, the men around the table voiced their agreement, some with words, some with grunts, some with a simple dip of the head. Not a big show. That wasn't how they did things. But the meaning was unmistakable, as clear and binding as anything written on paper. Ruby turned to Ethan. Her face was alight with something that could have powered the entire city block. "Told you," she whispered. "I told you, you have people now." Ethan's throat was tight, his eyes burned. He blinked and something warm slid down his cheek, cutting a clean line through the bandages and the dust and the residue of a day that had started with a van at a school gate and ended with his name being spoken in a room full of men who meant it when they said it. He had not cried in 8 months. Not when his mother died, not when the apartment was emptied, not when the older boys took his bag and his photograph and kicked him into a wall while the neighborhood watched. He had locked that part of himself away, sealed it behind a door. He told himself he'd never open again because crying was for people who had someone to hear them, and he had no one. But Ruby heard him, and Forge heard him, and the room full of scarred, tattooed men who had built their lives on the principle that vulnerability was a liability heard him and did not look away. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "I do." Forge rested his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Heavy, warm, the hand of a man who had been a boy like this, in a room like this, hearing words like these, and who had spent 30 years becoming someone worthy of saying them. "This city remembers two kinds of names," Forge said, his voice lower now for the three of them. "The ones who hurt children, and the ones who stand in front of them." He looked at Ethan. "You picked your side." Ethan laid his head back slowly. Exhaustion pulled at every part of him, the cumulative weight of 3 weeks of healing and one afternoon of bleeding and a lifetime of being nobody. But for once, the weight on his chest wasn't just pain. It was belonging. Ruby hopped off her chair and settled beside him, leaning her head against his arm. She smelled like crayons and laundry detergent and the particular warm sweetness of a child who has spent the day being brave. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I'm going to teach you how to draw a dog. You're terrible at dogs." Ethan laughed. It hurt his ribs. He didn't care. The pain was real, and the laughter was real, and the girl leaning against his arm was real, and that was more reality than he had owned in 8 months, and he would take every ounce of it, pain and joy, and all the complicated mess in between. "Okay," he said, "tomorrow." Outside, the engines ticked and cooled. The city moved on, lights flickering, traffic humming. People going about the business of their ordinary lives, unaware that in a squat brick building behind a row of shuttered shops, a story had just ended and another had just begun. The night deepened. Forge dimmed the lights. Men drifted toward the door in ones and twos, boots heavy on the floor, voices low, the murmured goodnights and see you tomorrows of people who had just participated in something they didn't have words for, but that they felt in their chests all the same. Ruby fell asleep first, her head on Ethan's arm, her breathing slow and steady, the breathing of a child who felt absolutely, completely safe. Her fingers were still curled loosely around his, even in sleep, as if letting go was something she had decided not to do. Ethan stayed awake a little longer. He looked around the room at the worn furniture and the patched walls and the men who were cleaning up quietly, moving with the careful gentleness of people trying not to wake a sleeping child. He looked at the photographs on the walls, decades of faces, some laughing, some serious, all bound together by something that wasn't blood, but that ran just as deep. He thought about his mother, about the promise she had made him keep. Be the kind of person who helps. He thought about the alley and the fists and the small hand gripping the back of his shirt. He thought about Ruby's voice saying, "You have people now," and Forge's hand on his shoulder, and the word ours spoken in a room full of people who understood what it cost. He thought about Decker showing up at the park with a garbage bag in his hand and a choice in his heart. He thought about Trent, whose anger had been built on a lie his brother told him, and who might, with time and accountability, build something better on the rubble. He thought about Wallace, a man he had never met, but who had saved Forge the way Forge was now saving him, a chain of rescue that stretched back through decades and might, if the world was kinder than it usually seemed, stretch forward into decades more. Forge sat in his chair at the end of the room, boots on the floor, eyes open, the last man standing. He was watching Ethan watch the room, and there was something on his face that he would never admit to and that Ethan would never mention. It was the expression of a man who had just discovered that the thing he had been searching for, the thing that had eluded him through 30 years of riding and fighting and building and losing, was not power or respect or territory. It was this, a room with children in it, a table with a boy who trusted him, a daughter who had taught him in the space of a single question, asked to a frightened bully, that the strongest thing in the world was not a fist or a gun or a line of motorcycles cutting through the dark. It was a 7-year-old girl asking, "Do you have a little sister?" and watching the walls come down. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in 8 months, Ethan Marsh fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow. Because for the first time in 8 months, tomorrow was something to look forward to. And in the morning when the sun came through the clubhouse windows and landed on the scarred table, and the sleeping children, and the man keeping watch over them, it lit the room in gold. Not the gold of wealth or fame or any of the things the world says matter. The gold of something simpler and rarer and harder to find. The gold of home.